Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to June on the Range. This is the second year of a great BookTube event created by Michael K. Vaughan, designed to celebrate Westerns, Western novels, Western short stories, all that sort of stuff, all that great source stuff that once upon a time you couldn't go into a bookstore. And some of you will be old enough to remember the metal spinner racks that had the little paperbacks on them. You couldn't, those metal spinner racks would be 30%, 40, 50% full of Westerns. Those days are over, and they don't appear to be coming back, but you can still find those paperbacks out there if you want, if you for some reason want to. And I did, ever since last year's June on the Range was such a hit. You know, when it comes to a BookTube event, you can look at view numbers or, subscriber counts or hashtags or stuff like that. But the way you will tell that your BookTube event is a hit is, do people love it? Do they actually love it? Do they talk about it for months afterward? Do they plan for it for months ahead of time? And that is definitely true with June on the Range. And I felt the same way. So when June on the Range was over last year, every time I was out and about and finding used books, I would grab mass market paperback Westerns, but not read them, which is not usually my custom. Unlike a lot of sexy super influencers who have book hauls on a regular basis and never see or think or talk about, never touch the books again, I usually read through the books that I haul. And with the Westerns, I made an exception. I absolutely did not do that. I put them in a pile to augment the vast amount of Western ebooks that I have. And I've been going through that pile. I don't think that's going to stay true. I think at the halfway point of June, I will probably start heavily mixing in the ebooks. I don't want them to go to waste. And the paperbacks will be here. I can read them, and I'll find more. I'm always going to be collecting Western novels now. But I did that last night. I picked a Western at random from the pile of old paperbacks that I have. I picked Shadow Mountain by Bliss Lomax. As you can tell from that name, Bliss Lomax is a pseudonym. This is another one of those Western writer figures where if you examine them, if you look them up, you realize that this was a person who wrote 500 books under 100 pseudonyms and wrote for 50 years. They live to be 90. They start writing these books for the pulps when they're in their 20s, and they just keep writing these books forever. Now, it might be that they start off writing 20 Western novels under the name Bliss Lomax or whatever name they pick, but eventually they make contacts, the books do well, they start to find other people, and they think, oh, well, so spy books do well too. All right, so I'll come up with a new pseudonym and I'll write 150 spy books. It's just an amazing ecosystem that you plug into once you start to examine these people. It's totally different from what things are like today, where if you've got a regular paperback thing going, well, it's you who's writing them. The closest equivalent that you would have would be the vast ecosystem of self-published books of ebooks, where you could authors frequently use pen names, and the same author will frequently use a dozen pen names. Here, it's the real-world version of that, and what I wouldn't give, I know I've been digressing this way on June on the Range all June, but what I wouldn't give for like a Plutarch's Lives of these people who wrote these books. You don't have to do a whole biography of them. Although I imagine that would be really interesting. A lot of them saw combat in World War II. They certainly you could go on and on about what it's like to live in the world of, have typewriter, will travel hack work. For me, that would not get old. But we barely have those kinds of books, even for the pulp hacks that made it huge. We barely have those. So I imagine that Bliss Lomax, or whatever his real name, I forget his real name, but his real name is no more convincing than Bliss Lomax. But I have a feeling that, like a lot of the authors that I've dealt with this June, he probably has an archive somewhere. Somebody could do a biography of him. There's probably somebody out there who has clippings. Certainly an obituary would be a place to start. But instead, we have the books. And we don't even have the books because they're not available anymore. Shadow Mountain probably had a few paperback editions and then went away. And all of Bliss Lomax went away. And all of Bliss Lomax's, all of this writer's pen names all went away. They're all gone. But I am finding it fascinating to experience their work again, or for the first time. The only thing that's not particularly fascinating is these old paperbacks with the colored text block. This happened at about page 3 for Shadow Mountain, and it is not worth fixing. It obviously is not worth fixing, so I will just throw this away. I don't really like to throw away books, but I'm never going to read this again. It's not in any shape that I can give it to anyone, so I couldn't sell it to the Brattle in this shape, so I'll just throw it away. This is from 1948, and this is the story of Reeves McLean, who, when the novel opens at least, is not a rootin'-tootin', two-fisted gunman. He actually has a friend. The sheriff in town, Sheriff Benteen, is his friend and is described that way. But Reeves McLean is the hero of this book. And look at this thing just flopping around here. To bring the note home, I will just wave the cover. This takes place in Ruby City. The novel is from 1948. The novel, the events in the novel take place 100 years before that. In Ruby City, Oregon, where in and around the environs of Shadow Mountain, a railroad is dying. A local trunk road is dying, but another railroad is being proposed. Is there any way that we could get a railroad straight through the Cascade Range? And wouldn't that make the fortunes of half the people that live in the shadow of Shadow Mountain? So once again, as with one of the earlier westerns that I read for June on the Range, also dealt with the logistics of railroads, what the railroads will do to the Old West, the kind of effect they'll have. There's a large amount of business talk in this book. I mean, there are rowdy gunmen, and Reeves McLean has to deal with rowdy gunmen. There is gunplay in this book, but a large part of this is business. How will businesses be hurt by a railroad dying? How will businesses be made by a railroad coming to life again? A new railroad coming to life again? That was interesting in a kind of way. I don't think Bliss Lomax was on his A game when he wrote this. To put it mildly, I don't think he was. This was fairly boring stuff. And I'll pick up the text of the book and show you what I mean by that. This is also a little bit of a check on rule number 2 on this channel, which is Steve is always right. I don't know if you remember, but when I started out June on the Range this year, I carefully demarcated what an Old West novel is. I said it had to be west of the Mississippi River, or at least west of the Missouri River. It had to be north of the Rio Grande. It had to be south of the Canadian border, and it had to be east of the Rockies. And I got a little of what the internet refers to as pushback for that, including from the originator of this event, who patiently reminded me that a great deal of Western type stuff takes place in California, which would not fit with my Star Trek coordinates there, and neither would Oregon. So I may need to revise those for next year's June on the Range, but I didn't want to include Hawaii. Sure shooting. I will encounter a Western that is set in Hawaii. Anyway, this was by the numbers, and if you were as prolific as Bliss Lomax, this guy wrote probably 300 books. If you're as prolific as that, you can't wait for the muse, and you can't wait for the book that you're currently banging out on your manual typewriter to start singing like a Puccini opera. You've got to go with what you've got and just get it done and deliver it on time. It'll sell. You'll get your money's worth. And I think that's this kind of a book. I don't think I've ever read anything else by Bliss Lomax writing under the name Bliss Lomax. I don't even know if I have any others. But let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about. See, look at this. Somebody already tried to reinforce this, probably 50 years ago. And even that didn't save it. So let me give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about here that will show a few things. Like, for instance, we have a talk here between Linda Cummings is a young lady here. She is the daughter of Lash Cummings, who is the biggest businessman in the area. Think of him as Ben Cartwright. And he owns most of Shadow Mountain. So it's of vital importance to him what happens with the railroads. Not just the one that may be going away, but the one that might be coming in, because the one that might be coming in might need to run through his territory, and that might ruin him. And a lot of times when this happened, the companies would buy the local senator to exert eminent domain. So you could be ruined by it. You couldn't stop it from happening. But Linda Cummings, Reeves McLean is kind of sweet on her. And they have, she has a conversation with another character, with Charlie Jessup, who is, I guess, what would count in this part of the country as new money. He's a big railroad speculator, and everybody is sort of salivating at the idea of him either making it big, in which case they can make it big on his coattails, or him taking a huge fall, in which case they get to gloat a little because he wasn't all that nice on the way up. So Linda is having a conversation with Jessup, and it goes like this. A little bit of it does. This is a lot of conversations, and this will go on forever. He's telling her about two guys named Ted and Jack that she might have known during her college days in Portland. Ted and Jack, eh? I remember them well, said Linda. Married, I suppose. Jack is. Both of them have important positions with Midwestern, that's the railroad company. Wherever you turn, you seem to run into some university young man or woman who's getting ahead. They're all over Portland. In another 10 years, they'll be running the town. Most of them were ranch bred, but couldn't find any opportunity at home. You could easily make a place for yourself at the top, Linda. I don't really know what Bliss Lomax is talking about here. Linda Cummings could certainly not have made a place for herself at the top in 1860s Portland. Maybe Bliss Lomax is thinking about, certainly Bliss Lomax is thinking about all of the ladies that stepped into the business world during World War II and were making it big in the 1940s when this book came out. She shook her head. My place is here, Mr. Jessup. I reached that decision some time ago. Dad won't admit it, but he's getting old. I have to take more and more of the load off his shoulders. I'm glad I'm able to do it. It doesn't leave me any time to spend envying my Portland friends. I don't know whether you'd say I was getting ahead or not, Mr. Jessup, but I'm not exactly wasting my talents. Of course not, he exclaimed, catching the rebuke. Don't misunderstand me, Linda. I don't know how Lash could get along without you. The work on the ranch is never done. I was hoping you'd had about enough of it, and I could count on your support. I know I can get further with your father if you're on my side. She was frankly puzzled. I don't believe I understand. Jessup chuckled. I'm sure you don't, Linda. I want to buy Box C. That's her father's main ranch. Buy Box C, she echoed incredulously. Surely you are not serious. Stock raising always turns out to be an expensive business when a rich man takes it up as a hobby. You know too much about it to ever put your money into it. Jessup agreed with a gust of laughter. I don't know about that. I'm no tenderfoot. Maybe I could avoid some of the mistakes, Linda. And their conversation goes on, and the thing that I want to point out here, in addition to how little that exchange trusts the reader, Elmore Leonard could have done that in 2 sentences. that exchange distrusts the reader completely. I need to take you by the hand and walk you through what's going on here. Not only that, but I also want to point out that in just what was that, 100 lines? The characters refer to each other by name about 50 times. Whereas in reality, you don't do that even once. In reality, you don't do that at all. In this exchange, they're doing it constantly, just to fill out the word count. Really kind of disappointing. And it gets to be more irritating than disappointing because it happens all the time in this book. But if we move forward, this book is almost 200 pages long. Almost. And well into that, probably 2/3 of the way through that, we get this exchange. They'll have to be south of the river. We'll swing east from town and start climbing before we reach the slope. Lash, that's Lash Cummings. We met him 100 pages ago. I can understand that. Suppose you put up your stakes and let me see just what you're going to do to me. I wouldn't like nothing better than to see a railroad put across the Cascades. If you can lay it out so it won't cut my South Range all to pieces, I'll make a fair deal with you. All right, Lash. Again, they're constantly calling each other by name. But I don't see how it can be done in the barely 3 weeks that's left before Midwestern pulls off the trains. I'd like to exercise my option and keep them running, but I wouldn't want to put the rest of the money into the line without knowing what I've got ahead of me. I can tell you frankly, there won't be much left of your South Range. You can't put a road straight up the slope. Just try to figure the grades and you'll realize that the tracks will be back and forth across the mountain 4 or 5 times before they reach the summit. Well, if that's the case, they'll cut me off from my water supply, the old cowman exclaimed uneasily. Now, the words that were quoted, if that's the case, you'll cut me off from my water supply, with an exclamation point. First of all, when you read that line, do you already know that it's an exclamation? Do you need to be told that the person speaking that exclaimed it? No, you don't. And someone exclaiming that someone is proposing cutting them off from their water supply, do you think that's probably going to be uneasy? Yeah, it is, and you already know that, so you don't need to be. And do you know that Lash Cummings is an old cowman? Yes, you do. So you don't need the old cowman exclaimed uneasily. But anyway, I don't know about that, Lash, Jernigan protested. I know about it. I'm dead willing to do what I can for Ruby City, but no one can ask me to ruin my ranch. So that's 4 times that Jernigan refers to Lash in 1 second of conversation, and all the rest of it, it's just... look at this. I instinctively put the cover in there as a bookmark, but I'm not going to do that because we're giving this thing an honorable burial. Unfortunately, my raucous return to June on the Range after an interruption was a bit of a dud. My return to Book Trek was pretty good, but Shadow Mountain, when it fell apart, I went, oh no. And this happened really early on that the cover pulled right off, and I thought, oh no. And I was thinking, clear plastic packing tape, I could probably, etc., etc. By the time I got to page 50 out of 180, I was saying, no, I don't really care. I'm not gonna put a single bit of energy into rescuing this thing. I'll just let it go. I'm never going to reread it. I didn't end up caring about any of the characters. The closest one that I ended up caring to was Linda Cummings. If it had been her book, maybe if someone else had written it. Like, for instance, we're told a few times, that scene that I read you was one example, but there are a couple of other examples in the book where her days going to school in Portland, which is the big city, are alluded to. And again, like I've mentioned with a couple of June on the Range books, when I was reading those allusions, I was thinking, okay, well, I would like to read that book. So none of this Shadow Mountain business, none of this railroad business. I'd like to read that book about Linda Cummings, but only if somebody else writes it. So I'm afraid it's a no-go for Bliss Lomax. I did not even bother to memorize all the other pseudonyms for this guy, so I may come across him again in June on the Range. I'm going to do a few more of these ratty old paperbacks, and I've also sort of officially decided this time around for June on the Range that I'm going to avoid the stuff that I know has any kind, that I know ahead of time has any kind of literary quality. I want to read the stuff that was being pumped out. So if I encounter something that I really like, Day of the Gun, Hanging at Whiskey Smith, if I encounter something that I think actually does have literary quality, I want it to come as a pleasant surprise. I want it to come when I least expect it, and something like this is when I least expect it. So, but I didn't get it this time around. So we'll see. I'm going to do the same thing all month long. I'm just going to spin the wheel and pick a Western to read tonight. And I will report back on it tomorrow. And I have heard a number of you have emailed and said, this thing that you're doing with Book Trek and with June on the Range, where you add a paperback of some kind to your night's reading, and then you give us a fun, engaging review of it the next day. Could you, when June on the Range and Book Trek are over, could you just keep doing that? Could you just keep doing that, maybe for every paperback in your collection? You people, you'll be the death of me. Anyway, that is my Western for this time around. Shadow Mountain, not much to write home about. I'm going to spin the wheel again. I'm just going to pick a book at random, and I will reconnoiter with you next time, and we'll see what I get. Thank you, BookTube.